Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And please come through and take some of the seats further down the front. My name is Sangeeta Chandrasekharan. I'm a research fellow at the University of Melbourne, and my research is focused a lot on energy equity, which is why I'm moderating this fantastic session on the health and energy nexus and the road to net zero. I'll just give you a bit of background and framing for this session and then explain how we're going to conduct the session. Whilst the energy sector is the single largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, it is a sector that's undergoing rapid transformation. We're on an exponential curve to increase deployment of renewable energy. By 2030, 40% of all electricity will be wind and solar. The pace of change, of course, is uneven. So renewable investments are concentrated in a smaller number of countries and regions, potentially leaving the poorest places behind. But that too is changing. The energy sector is being transformed not just by the challenge of decarbonization, but also by the forces of decentralization. So there are new possibilities for small-scale energy generation, such as rooftop solar, mini hydro, batteries, mini-grids. Electrification is much more realizable now for the billions who were left behind in the era of large-scale fossil fuels. Entire regions that the grid did not reach now have more cost-effective options for standalone power systems and reliable electricity. So this promise of energy abundance and universal access from renewable energy is tantalizing also from a health perspective. 1 billion people are served by health services with no reliable energy. Within the health and climate change discussion today, there has been much more of a focus on the negative impacts of climate change on health, as opposed to the co-benefits of climate change mitigation and the energy transformation for health. Health equity, I would argue, is insufficiently connected to the principles and the processes of the energy transition, and today we're really interested in making these links. In particular, we're asking, what can a health equity lens and a public health community bring to bear on the principles and the processes of this energy transition? What are the shared or bridging concepts and tools that we need to span the divide between health equity and energy justice? And what are the kinds of alliances we need to bridge the gap? Energy sector discussions tend to focus a lot on technologies and very material technological solutions. The social and the political are sometimes secondary considerations. So in this session today, we recognize that politics, and in particular geopolitics, plays a critical role in addressing health, energy, cost of living, climate crises. Whether it's hydropower in the Mekong, gas in Europe, or coal exports to Asia, cross-border politics shapes the geographies, the timing, and the nature of fossil fuel phase-outs. So what is the new kind of politics that we need to have a just and a healthy transition? To take us on this journey, we are really fortunate to have eminent experts from the fields of public health, finance, medicine, business, environmental, and social policy. So we will begin with a keynote address by Dr. Marina Romanella, followed by panel presentations and a discussion with our panelists who are here today, and I will introduce them a bit later, and also Dr. Omnia, who is joining us online. Following the panel discussion, there will be an opportunity for all of you in the audience to ask questions, and I really encourage you to engage with us after the armchair conversation. So I will now like to introduce Dr. Marina Romanella, who is joining us from the United Kingdom, where I understand it's the middle of the morning, maybe around 3 a.m. So we really appreciate Marina making the effort to deliver this keynote for our session. Dr. Romanella is the Executive Director of the Lancet Countdown, tracking progress in health and climate change. She has led a team of researchers in developing England's National Health Service and net zero commitments. She's a member of numerous advisory boards for projects focusing on health and climate change. She has a PhD in biomedical science from Cambridge University. I can't think of a better person to start us off in this session. Marina, are you there?
Hello, yes I am. Can you hear me?
Wonderful. I'll hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm actually really sorry I'm not there. I would love for it not to be 3 a.m. to start with, but also I would have loved to be there, and I had intended to come over to PMAC and to Bangkok, but unfortunately I couldn't make it happen. So thank you for your patience in an online delivery, and have a good PMAC. So I'm hoping that you can see my screen, but let me know if you don't. There we go, and I see it on screen as well. So I'm going to present to you today some of the findings of the latest report of the Lancet Countdown, which was launched last November. Last October. And what this report covers is a whole range of the intersection between climate change and health. But I'm going to focus today, obviously, on what pertains to this session, that is the intersections between the energy sector, the energy transition, and a thriving future. The work I'm going to present to you throughout is the product of an enormous amount of effort from 114 researchers that contributed to this year's report, that come from universities from around the world, as you can see on screen. And it's the 8th iteration of the Lancet Countdown's annual reporting. We produce these reports year on year with almost 50 indicators that monitor both the health impacts of climate change and the health implications of our action or inaction to tackle the climate crisis. The first finding that comes from the report, and it's a good grounding point, it's a good point for our overall understanding of why this is so critical, is that today, when we're at a decadal mean average of global temperature increase of 1.14 degrees, climate change is already costing us lives, costing us health, and costing us livelihoods all around the world. And in general, it is those that contributed the least to the climate crisis, the ones that are being disproportionately affected, both in countries that have contributed the least historically to global greenhouse gas emissions, but also within every country. It's always the vulnerable, the urban poor, those with least resources that are being disproportionately affected. And I won't delve too much into detail, but just to paint a bit of a picture of what that looks like, here I'm presenting to you some of the indicators in which we monitor the growing hazards, the growing risks, and the impacts of climate change. And we see a very rapid growth in heat-related mortality, in the impacts of heat exposure on workers, workers' health being affected, and labor productivity going down, alongside incomes, which obviously undermines the socioeconomic determinants of health and those economic conditions that determine health and well-being. We're seeing an increased incidence of extreme weather events, including droughts, floods, extreme storms, wildfires. We're seeing our food systems affected. We're seeing an increase in the risk of food insecurity and malnutrition. We're seeing also an increase in the risk of transmission of infectious diseases and exposure to extreme events that disproportionately affect the most vulnerable populations. This is just at 1.14 degrees of temperature rise, but we know that our current actions and policies are now taking us to somewhere around 3 degrees of global mean temperature rise by the end of the century. So under this trajectory, things will get enormously worse and very, very quickly. So it is important that we adapt to the current hazards, but it's imperative that we mitigate, that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to avoid that very grim scenario. Each ton of carbon dioxide that we continue to emit worsens our health outlook, worsens the impacts that we will be facing. And you have just heard about this, but when we look at where are emissions coming from, where are the drivers of the climate change that is threatening our current and our future health, the energy sector is by far the biggest single contributor. It contributes to about 75%, 73%, as you see on screen, of all the global greenhouse gas emissions. And it is also a sector which is a fundamental determinant of health. We have been trying to tackle greenhouse gas emissions, or committing to tackle greenhouse gas emissions, for decades now. Since at least the international commitments made within the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change that got signed in 1992, we have been promising to tackle greenhouse gas emissions. And the energy sector is a sector in which we have enormous opportunity for reducing emissions. However, we see that very little progress was made in terms of decarbonizing this sector, despite a very rapid growth in technologies available for zero emission energy production. As you can see on screen, fossil fuels still contribute to 80% of all of the global energy supply. Greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector continue to increase. They increased by 0.9% in 2022, following a dip in the COVID-19 pandemic. And that means that both in 2021 and in 2022, global greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector reached record high levels. So we're not only not reducing our emissions, but we're actually increasing them. And as you can see in the graph that I'm showing you here in the bottom, the percentage of electricity and the production of energy from clean renewable energies, modern energies like wind, solar, geothermal, tidal energy is growing very fast. It is really growing very fast. However, globally, they still make up only 9.5% of all of the global electricity generation. And when we look at what's happening across different countries, we see that there's enormous inequality in how renewable energies have been developed and adopted. What you can see here in the graph that I'm showing you in the bottom is the percentage of electricity produced from renewables divided by countries according to their Human Development Index. And as you can see, there's a very clear gradient whereby countries with higher levels of Human Development Index are by and large at the forefront of the development of these technologies and adoption of these technologies, whereas low Human Development Index countries are lagging behind, with a difference from 11 to 2.3% of all electricity. And this is not about electricity though. It's not only about electricity. Electricity and access to energy is a fundamental determinant of health. Is the Sustainable Development Goal 7 that's set to eliminate energy poverty. But as you have heard, we still have almost 1 billion people that still live without access to electricity. This means they don't have access to basic information services, they don't have access to lighting, to refrigeration, essential for keeping medicines, for keeping food. And we still have close to 1 billion people today that are served by healthcare facilities that lack reliant access to energy. This means that these facilities cannot hold surgeries, that they cannot run incubators to keep babies that need incubators as they're born. Women often have to deliver in the dark. They cannot run essential healthcare services. Beyond the health system, energy is fundamental for development. And what I'm showing you here on the right is some of the big indicators of energy and health, particularly coming from the SDG 7 and from surveys that the WHO develops, that looks at the use of energy inside people's homes, the energy that people have access to. And what we see is that 2.4 billion people still use polluting and inefficient fuels within their homes. And 66% of all household energy still comes from dirty fuels, biomass and fossil fuel burning. This means that these sources of energy are generating enormous levels of air pollution inside people's homes, that people are breathing toxic air inside their homes. And once again, if we look at what's happening across countries with different levels of Human Development Index, clear gradient once again here, showing that inequity in the access to clean energy. Biomass burning dominates the energy source in low Human Development Index countries. 92.4% of people still use biomass inside their homes, whereas in very high Human Development Index countries, this drops to just 7.5%. So that inequity in the adoption of clean energy is translating to health inequities and inequities in the possibilities of a healthy development. And this is important because, as I said, it has to do with air pollution. Our estimates are very conservative. We estimate that about 2 million deaths every year occur due to the burning of dirty fuels. As you can see in screen in the graph, biomass burning within the household sector is a massive contributor, but also coal burning, a completely avoidable source of air pollution, still contributing significantly to global mortality from air pollution. And inside people's home, 140 deaths per 100,000 across 62 countries. That is an enormously high mortality rate due to exposure to indoor air pollution that comes from the burning of solid fuels, of dirty fuels that are avoidable. There's estimates that came recently from some colleagues that estimate that death attributable to air pollution from dirty fuels, and particularly from fossil fuels, could be about 5 times higher than our estimates. What we see is that not only the most vulnerable are being worst affected by climate change, but they're also being left behind in a clean energy transition. Renewable energies have become cheaper than fossil fuel energies. They're more stable. They're not subject to geopolitical crisis, as we've seen with the energy crisis since 2021. And they're a viable option that could be implemented locally, off-grid, independent of energy grid access, which is often not available for remote communities. The most concerning thing, though, is that we're not only not moving as fast as we should be in the adoption of these technologies, but we're actually, in many senses, moving in the wrong direction. So when we look at what's happening in the fossil fuel sector, the main single culprit of emissions from the energy sector and the biggest single contributor to the climate crisis, we see that the 20 largest oil and gas companies are increasing their oil and gas production plans, even in the past year or so. We see that in 2022, they were on track with their commitments and their investments to exceeding the goals of the Paris Agreement by 112% more emissions than they should to keep us within 1.5, and that has grown to 173% in 2023. So they're expanding the oil and gas production plans rather than promoting that clean energy transition. And this by and large comes because of the windfall profits of the high energy prices that came with the energy crisis that was exacerbated in 2021. A clear driver of this is our private investments, and I know that we will be talking a lot more about this in terms of what banks are doing and their loans to the energy sector. But what we see is that since the Paris Agreement entered into force in 2016, private bank lending to the oil and gas sector, the biggest driver of oil and gas expansion, has increased to 572 billion, up from 549 billion before the Paris Agreement. And we're seeing that 52% of the biggest lenders, of the biggest banks that lend to the oil and gas sector, have increased their lending since the Paris Agreement entered into force. So we're financing the expansion of oil and gas that is jeopardizing our future. And it's not only the private sector, the public sector is doing so too. So when we look at a critical determinant of the expansion of oil and gas, that is our subsidies to the oil and gas sector, we look at what countries are doing in terms of implementing carbon taxes and implementing subsidies to oil and gas, and what the net price and the net value of those activities are. And we see that out of the 87 countries that we analyzed that contribute to over 95% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, 78% are still providing net subsidies to the oil and gas sector. In 2020, in the year that we were at the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, this amounted to $305 billion going to fossil fuel subsidies, often coming from taxpayers' money, from public funds. And what I'm showing you on screen in the graph that you see in the bottom is this represented as a percentage of the health budget. And you can see that for over 30% of countries, the allocation of funding to oil and gas subsidies exceeds more than 10% of their total health budget. Again, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 10% of the health budget was allocated to fossil fuel subsidies. And for some of these countries, this represents more than 100%. So we're not only not promoting the transition away from oil and gas, but we're actually effectively subsidizing and financing the expansion of oil and gas, often for amounts that could be redirected to improving health, to improving well-being, and to activities that actually promote sustainable and healthy development. Despite what are pretty grim trends and despite very concerning changes in the last few years as a result of the energy crisis and the growing profits from the oil and gas sector, we're seeing some signs of progress, which are very important to keep in mind because they show us that there's a healthier way forward that is possible and is starting to emerge and that we need to be promoting a lot more. So what I'm showing you here on the left is employment in the renewable energy and fossil fuel industries. And the finding that I'm highlighting is that employment in the renewable energy sector increased by 5.6% in 2021, reaching a record of nearly 12.7 million employees worldwide. The reason why this is important in the context of health is that these are local jobs, are jobs that in general, have less exposure to environmental pollutants, that are healthier jobs and have less risk factors associated to them, and that are jobs that go into local communities and could be accessible in areas that still are developing their energy sector. So this is a fundamental determinant of the socioeconomic factors that condition our health and well-being. And what you can see on the right is a bit of a counter side of what I just told you about private sector lending for oil and gas. That is green bank lending. So it's lending from private banks to the green energy sector. And what you can see in the graph in the bottom is that although fossil fuel lending overall is not reducing, what we are seeing is that the green energy sector lending is growing enormously exponentially, and that it has reached almost, not quite yet, but almost the same level as oil and gas lending. And these are the types of trends that we want to see more of. So with this, I will just close and remind you that there's a very enormous amount of possibilities of delivering a thriving future, that we could still be delivering an energy, low carbon, sustainable transition, that renewable energies are not a magic bullet, but are definitely an enormously powerful tool for enabling our climate goals and also fair, equitable and sustainable development. But those technologies need to be made available to communities on the ground. We need to have much better sharing of know-how and technologies, and much better financing and a healthy change of financial flows towards promoting a healthy economy. I would invite you also to visit lanceaccountant.org, where we have a lot more information of the report and of the findings of this year, and you can explore the data in a lot more detail. And I welcome any questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Marina, for a really informative presentation that had extremely sobering data in there, talking about avoidable deaths, that we are actually moving in the wrong direction in terms of continued fossil fuel growth and therefore emissions, but also progress. And renewables are indeed a good news story. I wondered if we could just unpack a bit this uneven development around renewables. And my question is, how do we avoid the scenario where there's successful decarbonization in advanced economies, but meanwhile there's a shift of fossil fuel electricity to lower income countries, which in effect is exporting pollution from the wealthy nations to the poorest nations that are already overrepresented in terms of the health impacts from dirty fuels, as you described?
To me, the inequities in the transition are just a clear readout of our overall global inequities in the climate crisis altogether and the drivers of the climate crisis. And as you said, we're seeing that it's low and middle income countries that are becoming these emerging markets for toxic energy sources and for an industry that need not exist in the future and should not exist in the future. So when we talk about, and this is what underpins our transition, equity and differentiated but shared responsibilities in our actions to tackle climate change, the way in which we will support sustainable development and fair distribution of renewable energies is core to that transition. We often hear that low-income countries are still dependent on fossil fuels and still need fossil fuels for well-being, for their access to energy, which is essential for development, is essential for health. And that is true, but that is a problem. Low-income countries should not be dependent on fossil fuels, particularly because those fossil fuels in general don't generate revenue for those countries, and particularly for the local communities. In general, they are with big international capital. That is not always true, but often is the case. But also because we have an economy of the future that is developing, and by and large is being developed in high-income countries. The technology of the future, the energy of the future, the know-how is being held at high-income countries. So what we're seeing is this enormous divide in the way that the future will look like, whereby we're still at risk of recreating colonialist relationships and very harmful commercial relationships between high-income and low-income countries, whereby those very fundamental energy services are still held within high-income countries. And low-income countries have to be dependent on international and foreign technologies and not promoting local jobs, local economies, local development, which is a huge problem.
We might pick that up in the discussion with the panel as well. Just one small follow-up question. I was wondering whether you've talked a lot about showing us very compelling data. It seems to me that there's also a narrative that needs to change, a narrative that better links health, equity, and energy justice. And I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on the kind of narratives that could make a difference coming from public health, and could also convince those in the energy sector and the finance sector as well that we need to be making much faster and deeper change.
Absolutely. And I think as a core of that narrative is understanding that when we talk about energy, we're not talking about industries. We're talking about a fundamental health service. It's fundamental to our health and our well-being because it allows us not only to access electricity service, basic electricity service, but it's essential for information services. It's very hard to reach communities that don't have access to energy with our public health interventions. It allows us to cool our medicines. It allows us to prepare our food and have our food refrigerated and avoid transmittable diseases, promote our hygiene. It allows us to study. It allows us to develop altogether our very basic services in local communities. And the divide that we have generated between energy and health has been enormously problematic, as seen by our enormous level of exposure to air pollution. And that's why we always say it's so important that we have health professionals sitting within every room in which international negotiations are being made on the energy transition, of tackling the climate crisis, because what we need to think about is that all of these are not services to our economy, are not services to our industry, are services to our humans and the economies and the industry and the societies that humans depend on. So energy as a fundamental driver of development is a fundamental also determinant of health and well-being, and that is what we need to understand in how we envision a fair future.
I think that's extremely well put and will resonate within the energy sector as well, which sometimes tends to think about electricity as kilowatt hours that needs to move from one place to another, as opposed to energy as a service for health and well-being. Thanks very much, Marina. Now, we're going to turn to the panel now, who will be able to provide their own perspectives on this topic and hopefully some reflections on your own presentation, Marina. So we will begin with another speaker who's online. Each speaker will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and have a conversation with all of the speakers together. So our first speaker is Dr. Omnia El Omrani, who's online. Omnia is a policy fellow at Imperial College London. She's also a medical doctor. She's been a health envoy for the UN Conference of the Parties on Climate Change, a Lancet Commissioner on Sustainable Healthcare. She's advised numerous multilateral agencies such as UNICEF and the European Union Director General. And she's been recognized for her efforts both by the public health community as well as by the media. She's been noted as a rising star. So Omnia will speak first. I might introduce all of the speakers now, and then we can move seamlessly from one speaker to the next, if that's okay. So after Omnia, Mr. Pipit Aneknithi is going to speak. So Mr. Pipit is president of the Kasikorn Bank here in Thailand, and he's held that role since 2017. He's been instrumental in steering the bank in its expansion into China and other parts of Southeast Asia. And so he has a wealth of expertise in the finance sector and decision-making around that. And some of you may have heard his presentation in the plenary this morning, which showed us that. He's also been actively involved in leading the bank's sustainability efforts and steering the organization towards net zero. After Mr. Pipit, we have Mr. Jeffrey Cha, who describes himself as a serial entrepreneur and investor in sustainable energy. His company, Sogo Energy, supports renewable energy infrastructure for irrigation in rural communities in Laos and also in other parts of Asia and other parts of the world as well. He's created a renewable energy retailer to fast-track solar power in Japan, and he serves on numerous boards, and he's a professor who teaches in many different countries, including Thailand. And last but not least, we have Shweta Narayanan, who has over 2 decades of experience in advocacy and community organizing on environmental justice issues. She coordinates an international NGO which works across 80 or more countries to make healthcare more available and more sustainable. And the NGO is called the Global Climate and Health Campaign for Healthcare Without Harm. So we might go to Dr. Omnia now, who's online. Omnia, are you there?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead and you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And like Marina said, I wish I was able to join you in person, but I'm happy to have the opportunity now to reflect on the incredible work that the Lancet Countdown has been doing for many years, and most urgently now. I think what Marina has demonstrated is how urgent it is for us to leverage the policies, the technologies, the financial levers, and the governmental policies for just transition, as well as the broader sector across all the different sectors to protect health. And this means that we are keeping social justice and health equity at the center of what policies are delivering and being designed to do. But what we are witnessing right now, from my own perspective, is an intergenerational inequity crisis, because what I've seen as a physician is not a single day passes without a child or an adolescent presenting with asthma exacerbations or lung infections that now no longer respond to antibiotics. And it has become such a new normal for a physician in Cairo. And what I've seen afterwards in my role as the youth envoy is how young people are continuously shouldering the burden of climate change and climate inaction and fossil fuel-driven air pollution levels on their health, but equally seeing the rising and the challenging political involvement of fossil fuel companies, and being very hard and having their involvement really backtracking the promises and the commitments that countries are making. So we feel very overwhelmed and burned out because of the lack of urgent action being taken against these fossil fuel interests, and at the same time what countries are doing in the interest of young people's health, well-being, and future. But what I've seen as the health envoy, but also for so many years since I started working at the intersection between climate and health as a medical student, as part of the global climate and health community, is how we have worked tirelessly to put people and health at the center of the climate negotiations and discussions. The health community has collectively used our trusted voice in order to recognize and to elevate that when we are negotiating the amount of fossil fuels that are burned out, that are being subsidized, and we know that only in 2022 fossil fuel subsidizations increased from 5 to 7%, which means 7 trillion US dollars has been put into the subsidization of fossil fuels. And we have leveraged that. In doing that, we are actually subsidizing the health of the people who are now losing their lives, their health, their land, and their livelihoods. We are also subsidizing air pollution and the premature death of more than 8 million people. We are subsidizing the increased intensity of a changing climate and its associated threats and its impact on the health of the current and the future generations. It's not only the physical health, but also the mental health of the population that is on the line. But what I see when I look at that intersection between health, geopolitics, and energy is how health can be a means of measuring our success, measuring our progress. When we look at the number of lives that we are saving by equitably transitioning, by reducing air pollution, we can save 3.6 million lives and even more. When we address climate change, we can save even more from infectious diseases. When we integrate mental health care services to address climate-related impacts, we're also saving people's lives, but also saving billions of US dollars, up to 47 billion every year by 2030. These are the ways that we can use the health argument as a way of measuring our progress. The second thing, when we look at health in this critical intersection, it is a way to propel the solidarity and the action that is needed. We see this at COP because countries who recognize that when they come to COP, they are overcoming their differences because they are negotiating the health of their children and young people. And on the other hand, these very young people are holding them accountable, are leveraging their activism, judicial systems to hold them accountable for the lack of urgent action needed to equitably transition and to address the climate crisis and to protect their health. And finally, and most importantly, when we use the health argument to showcase that these frontline challenges, these stories of the patients that are being affected every day are leveraged in a way that is empowering the developed countries, the frameworks that are being designed, it is using the health argument to protect the health of the most vulnerable in these discussions, and also creating means of implementations and financial frameworks that factor in the necessary transition that is needed, in combination with mitigating the health impacts, in combination with the health co-benefits that are being saved, and using this whole narrative. When we look and we know that with the outcome of COP28, there is a mention of fossil fuel, and yet what is missing is that means of implementation, financial frameworks, and lastly and most importantly, the health benefits and the health impacts that would be mitigated if we truly transition away from fossil fuels.
Thank you very much, Omnia. We'll go straight to the next speaker, Mr. Pippin, please. Yes, please. And I think we have some slides.
So thank you so much for having me on this session once again. And also would like to thank you, the first speaker, Dr. Marina, for sharing very comprehensive information that I do not need to mention a lot about, and I can jump into the other relevant page, right? And this is something I just would like to draw attention to the audience once again, based on the information, comprehensive information shared by the Dr. Marina. So basically, what I like to draw a conclusion from her information is that the global climate crisis equals global health crisis. And then, you know, what we are going to do as banker, this is what I try to contextualize and also interpret what is going to happen, right? How we are going to move into the net zero together, leaving no one behind. On your left-hand side of this slide, you can see, you know, the major powers are trying very hard to ask the rest of the world to comply with their own carbon tax or carbon standard. We've heard about the CBAM from EU. A couple of weeks ago, I got a phone call from one of my friends, who are our customers, that they are required to fill out a lot of information because they have been trading with European Union for so long time, right? I can imagine if I talk to one of my clients, right, who are multinational companies, they've been trading carbon credit, in the European market based on the ETS standard. But for those small and medium enterprises in Thailand, and I think that it is also applicable to the small and medium enterprises, across the world. And in Thailand, particular, the small and medium enterprise sector employed about 70% of our workforces. So my only concern is that if everyone has to comply with the new standard imposed by the major power, Chinese, the US, and the EU, what is going to happen, right? And on the right-hand side, what I'd like to illustrate here, on the y-axis, the level of greenhouse gas emission, right? And on the x-axis, right, is a timeline based upon the commitment, be it, from Paris Agreement and the most recent one, the COP28 in Dubai. So, but look at each country, big and small, middle income, lower income countries, they have their own problems to tackle, i.e. the energy trilemma. Some of you might have been aware of that, i.e. the energy security, the energy equity, and also the environmental sustainability, i.e. the green energies or renewable energy, which needs technology, right? So rather than, what I try to call out here is that, we need to work together for collaborative progress, and it has to be progressive collaboration as well at the same time. So as a bank, having said that, as bank in Thailand, we are quite pioneer bank in Thailand, trying to help our customers on the decarbonization transition. We can strike delicate pace of green transition actually. On the left-hand side, if you look at the own operation of our own bank, I think, the numbers is more or less the same. This is just to give you examples of a real own operation of Kasikorn Bank in Thailand. For our own operation, the carbon emission accounts for just only 9% or even less than that. But 91% that we need to deal with is from our finance portfolio, i.e. we lend to our customer or we invest in our customer in terms of equities and many different kinds of financial instruments. So under scope 1 and 2, we plan to achieve the net zero by 2030. It's not a big deal for big corporation like Kasikorn Bank. We are in the service industry. We are not the biggest emitter, right? But on the scope 3, that we need to be really responsible for, right? To help our customers transition. We recently announced that we are ready to allocate a capital, by 2030 of 200 million Thai baht, 200 billion Thai baht in sustainable financing and investment. But again, if we just continue to do the business as we have been doing, over the past 100 years, a banking sector, so we focus just only the conventional finance, i.e., in the middle of the circles on the right-hand side. But now we are moving into green financing. I'm very, very, very glad, to hear, to see the statistic, which is very interesting, is that the green financing is nearing the fossil fuel financing at the moment. But it will not be enough to accelerate the transition into the low carbon economy. So the bank needs to think even beyond banking. So we talk about the credit, we talk about carbon credit, we talk about the subsidy. So now, we are looking or moving into the carbon credit solution. We are working on the certificate aggregator. We are working on the carbon tokenization. And we are going to be a broker and dealer for the carbon credit. And also we work on the reforestation and afforestation. And we are looking forward very soon, to launch the carbon exchange market. This is something, the bank has a role to play beyond conventional banking. And further beyond that, this is a what we call here is expanded beyond banking. We are going to be the total solution service provider. Carbon accounting, solution referrals, carbon disclosure. That means, we need to collaborate. We need to team up, with the experts of many different fields, of the future career related to decarbonization. And this is our mission that has already almost everything, I show you on this slide. We have already embarked upon the new journey, trying to work even beyond conventional banking as the financial service provider. So this is the beginning of my part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pipit, for the part 2 of your slides from today, after today's plenary. That was great. We will now go to you, Jeffrey, if that's okay. And once again, I think there are slides. We're just pausing, Marina and Omnia, while we get these slides arranged. Okay, looks like we're ready to go.
Good morning. Thanks. My name's Jeff Char. I'm originally from Hawaii, but I'm a long-term resident of Japan. And to be honest, I feel really out of place here. With all the medical doctors and PhDs, I feel like a fish out of water. I'm an energy geek. I've actively been involved in trying to deal with climate change, the climate crisis, from an energy aspect. And I've been doing this for the last 15 years. What drives me, however, is not what drives my customers. It took me a long time to realize this. A lot of times when I was getting started, I would try to convince them to buy something that I thought was better for them. But at the end of the day, they just wanted what was cheaper. And so I had to step back and kind of reevaluate things and change my approach. So I think the climate crisis actually offers us a big opportunity to solve both the climate crisis itself, the energy transition, but also to make it a more just and equitable switchover. And obviously that would also help improve our health. So what I do is, at one of my companies, we're operating in Cambodia. We are not allowed to sell electricity there. So instead what we do is we build solar-powered pumping stations, and we pump water and sell the water to farmers. What we're doing is we're displacing the fossil fuel or the diesel generators that they're currently using to pump. And if I try to replace each pump one by one, I'll fail. But instead what we do is we go and talk to a community, which is much larger, and then I can build a larger pumping station at scale. And at that scale, I can undercut the cost of diesel. So my sale of water is cheaper to the farmer than for them to just go and buy diesel fuel and run their own pump. I think that's a winning solution. The problem I have, though, is financing this. Renewable energy oftentimes requires a higher cost up front. So it's not that the developing markets or these emerging economies that they want to use fossil fuels, it's that they can't afford the upfront cost of investing in the renewable energies. So that's what I'm trying to bridge here. We deal with farmers of all ages and all genders, and typically the women farmers actually appreciate our service more because it's more convenient. They don't have to carry fossil fuel or diesel fuel. They don't have to move the heavy generators, and so they prefer it much better. It's also quiet and, of course, clean. One of my biggest challenges, however, is NGOs. They have trained the local population to expect things for free. This screws up my business. A lot of the NGOs are well-meaning, but their implementation sucks. Right? So if they were to plan things longer term include more people in the decision-making process, they could actually do a lot more. I'm not saying they'd have to spend more, they would just have better effects with what they do spend. Sorry, in irrigation in particular, we see a lot of these grant-funded projects where they go out and they build these things for free. Often they're paying the local vendors up front, and then they go and take a lot of photos to send back and show to their donors. And then the projects usually fail in a few years. In our case, we don't get paid up front. We're making a long-term investment. If I cannot collect every month, I'm going to go out of business. But we collect back the cost of our investment over a long period of time. So it's in my best interest to provide a good service. Otherwise, my customers stop paying for it. And I can only stay in business if they continue to pay for it. And then I can pay back the banks. So I think a longer term approach would be very helpful. And then lastly, I just say that, again, to reiterate, the climate crisis is an opportunity. In fact, it's a massive opportunity for all of us. We can do better for everyone by solving the energy transition, but doing it in a just way. But it requires that we all work together. I think if we all try to do things on our own, siloed, we're going to come up with less than ideal solutions. So I'm really looking forward to working with all of you, and including the bank, and hopefully we can get this fixed together. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Sveta.
Thanks, Sangeeta. I was telling Sangeeta earlier that one of the advantages of going last is that you don't have to say much because your fellow panelists have said everything. And I'm really grateful to this wonderful panel to put their points and their perspective forward. I'm going to talk about a couple of things. First of all, I want to dispel certain assumptions when we are talking about a transition and a just transition. And the assumptions are that a renewable energy future is going to be just. That's an assumption. That's not the fact. The assumptions are also, when we talk about just transition, we start from a point of designing a future that is just, and sometimes and often ignore that there are current prevalent injustices that needs fixing, and if you do that, you are shaping a just future. And sometimes we forget about the injustices when we are thinking of a future. And I agree with Jeff that the climate crisis is an opportunity for us. It's a great crisis. It is an existential health threat, but it's also an opportunity to correct the historical injustices, to fix the social and economic model that has been a side of the fossil fuel economy that we are part of, and to fix those injustices in when we are designing a future, because we have an opportunity to decide a just future. Now, also, when we talk about a just transition, we often mistake energy transition with a just transition. We're not about talking about replacing a fossil fuel economy with a renewable economy. We have to pause and think about what are the problems that we are experiencing in the current economy and how that cannot be repeated when we are imagining a new economy, a low carbon economy. So centralized energy systems, be it fossil fuel or renewable, are not going to be benefiting the most marginalized if we are talking about leaving no one behind. And I think here, health has a very interesting role to play. And again, I want to be very cautious, and these are my couple of dispelling assumptions. As a social scientist, when I think of health, I don't think of health as a co-benefit. I think of health as a focal point, a foundational consideration in deciding what kind of future we want, or in deciding how just the future is going to be. And there is a difference, and I'll explain this difference with one example. Now, we're talking about transitioning our transportation system, which is fossil fuel based, to EV based. right? And that sounds like a good climate solution, and will also improve the air quality, so there is a health co-benefit. Now, this is where the co-benefit versus foundational consideration makes a difference. Now, if you think of just transitioning one form of transportation system with a climate-friendly form, you're still promoting private transport, you're still excluding people who don't have access to transport any form from the transportation system. Now, when you have a health consideration, these are the historical injustices that gets dismantled. Then you will automatically, and again, my assumption is that you'll automatically, with the health foundational, start thinking of bike paths, active forms of non-motorized transport, designing cities in which you don't have to commute for 3 hours to get from point A to point B, or from your place of residence to workplace. It completely shifts the way you're thinking about a system, and that's what is needed at this point when we're thinking about a just transition. It is a fundamental shift in which, and it's going to be a very uncomfortable fundamental shift. It's changing the way we see our world around in a manner that is truly inclusive and leaves no one behind. Now, the other problem that I also have when we're talking about a transition is that we often or in a climate conversation also, we are too fixated with the carbon debate. And sure enough, it's a huge problem, the carbon emissions, and moving away from carbon emissions is fundamental. But then if we are too fixated on carbon, and this is again where health argument makes a difference, then we are also, and we have seen a lot in the COP28 summit most recently, the fossil fuel industry moves towards false solutions or dangerous distractions, as we call it, because the time to act is really limited, and the carbon-based solutions become like something like carbon capture, where it allows the fossil fuel industries to continue as business as usual as long as there's a problem that, oh, carbon is a problem, we'll capture the carbon, and the problem is resolved. But that's not the fact. The fact that fossil fuel industries are also poisoning our water, our soil, our communities, from where the whole extractive process is damaging the very social fabric, needs to be considered when we're talking about the dangers of fossil fuel industry. And that is not going to be fixed by just a technical solution. And I'm not going into the merits of carbon capture, which is a different debate altogether. But with the urgency that we have, and when you're looking at the justice framework, what is the solution that you're promoting? And again, health being the focal point can transform that debate and counter some of these distractions. And I call them distractions because the evidence is that we have less than 6 years to really act to prevent a catastrophe that in many parts in low and middle income countries we are already experiencing. The German Climate Risk Index, I think 2022, showed that 8 out of 10 most vulnerable countries to climate disasters are low and middle income countries. So there is a catastrophe that we are experiencing, and to avert a further catastrophe, we have to act now. And how do we act now without getting distracted, without getting fixated by, just switching one form or another? This is something we're talking, like, it's imagine a wheel that is problematic. Changing cogs in the wheel is going to work, or changing the direction and the way the wheel is functioning is going to work. So I think we need to kind of look at a bigger picture, and health gives us that agency to look at society in a larger sense, where our planetary health, our human health, our economic health are all interdependent. So that becomes really, really important. And just a minute about, especially given that I work closely with the health sector, I think the health sector itself has a huge role to play in shaping the way we are looking at this transition. A health sector that has to be climate ready, resilient, and also low carbon. And that means investing in local solutions, investing in primary health care and universal health coverage, and also ensuring, and this is where I think Marina and Omnia also reflected. The health sector itself advocating for a transition away from fossil fuels. The moral, ethical, and credible power that the health sector has needs to be utilized at this moment to talk about a transition that is healthy and truly just. So the health sector has a role to play, and in the conversation we can talk about what that solution, what that just future really looks like. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. We've heard so many important concepts and also some quite tangible solutions that need to be on the table to be able to address what is a dual crisis, a health crisis and a climate crisis. And we've also heard so much about the opportunity that is inherent in this energy transition that's underway. So I want to bring us back to this question of politics and geopolitics, because I think it was perhaps a bit more implicit than explicit in some of our discussions. So I want to begin by asking how you see the work that you do, all of you do, in being able to either counter geopolitical instability, or as Omnia said, a lack of political leadership on things like subsidies. How do you actually see the work you do working to counter the politics of the day? And how do you actually see the work you do as changing the politics of the day? Are you working kind of against the politics, or is there actually hope for us to be changing the politics through action at an organizational level, at a regional level, and also at a local level? I might ask if there's a response from Omnia and Marina first. What's the kind of politics that can make a difference from your perspective?
Thank you, sir. Struggling a bit to unmute. I think that's a very interesting question. More than like the specific policies, I think it's the way in which we envision and we shape those policies. As Shweta just said, there's a lot of ways in which you could decarbonize. Some of them are wonderful for health and some of them really aren't. So in shifting the way that we deliver policies for not only the energy sector, that is what we're talking about, but also the food sector, our general infrastructure, the way that we deliver care, keeping people's well-being at the center of that conversation is fundamental. And having health outcomes as a key metric to monitor progress and to monitor the effectiveness of our interventions will also allow us to identify what could be potential undesirable harms of policies that could happen. Shweta mentioned the transport sector. We could lead to enormous inequities in access to energy if we just rely on private vehicles, on electric vehicles, and we don't promote equity in the way that we access transportation systems and the energy needed for that. You could also deliver a lot of policies for climate change that end up undermining fundamental goals for health and well-being because we're redirecting funds and stop taking care of other fundamental determinants of health. So in every way in which we develop these policies, I think having the health sector at the table and having metrics of human health as well and well-being to monitor and evaluate those interventions as a key outcome and an end goal is what will generate a shift from delivering tick box policies or siloed policies that might harm health towards delivering policies that truly enable a transformation of the way that our societies work, that our economies work, to enable a thriving future. Because at the end of the day, as I said before, we're not here to take care of our economies. We're not here to take care of our industries. We're here to take care of the fundamental determinants of health, of which our economies and our industries are, but with the end goal of promoting healthier futures.
Thanks. Omnia, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, what I also wanted to add in terms of my work is two areas. So first of all is having that narrative shift around when we're talking about energy, we're talking about health, we're talking about people's lives, we're talking about young people's lives, and really bringing in the discussions and the complexity of the transition discussions into communities' understanding and knowing that it is fundamentally about health, and it is about protecting and promoting health, and it is about shaping a healthier future where we're looking into cleaner air, greener spaces, access to energy, to healthcare facilities, to basic food, water, all of these fundamental elements that are defined by our use of energy, but also that are the determinants of our health. And also working towards a more equitable and just communities and future. The second thing, which is part of the work that I'm doing, which is the elements of holding accountability. And many young people now are setting up ways to hold corporations as well as governments accountable if they do not transition. And using the health argument in terms of how air pollution is impacting the health of the younger generation. And this can be leveraged to judicial systems. And it's not just about doing our advocacy and our campaigning, but also utilizing the law and legislations to hold these different actors accountable if they do not act in the interests and in the health of the younger generation, which is also a powerful advocacy tool. But this tool is also further empowered by using the health numbers and the health impacts and the co-benefits that many young people now are utilizing.
So can I ask Mr. Pipit and also Jeff, these issues of accountability and how you actually operationalize these processes of disclosure so that you can do your due diligence in financing, do proper risk assessment. When you hear about taking into account these metrics around health, what does that actually look like to you from an organizational and investment perspective?
So, start first, right? So, to be honest, we haven't been taking in consideration, the negative consequences, in the health perspective, right? But what we have been working so far, based upon what we really understand the world. But this is my first time for me as well, to hear about the commercial determinants of health, right? But in terms of the commercial determinants of economics, of these kind of so many different dimensions, right? We have been aware of that, right? But so far, internal operations, we start looking at the carbon emission or greenhouse gas emission, right? We set a very clear target. We develop so-called the glide path, how we are going to decarbonize which particular sector, what exactly we are going to do. So we come up with the so-called the customer engagement on those specific sectors, right? That they are the biggest emitter, right? That pretty much relate to the carbon emission, right? And then something else we have been working is, to develop the so-called internal guideline, for example, the green asset ratio. So, the amount of money you lend, to support the sustainable financing or green financing, right, compared with the conventional, I would like to say, brown financing, right? So we keep monitor, right, so that, we can see our progress and make sure that, but again, we are a part of global capital market. We need to satisfy, the return on equity to our shareholders, right? So next step, I think, as I brought to the table, I brought to the stage in the previous session, now what we have been doing is changing the business model of our bank. But if we would like to move further, we need to change, or we need to change, or we need to convince policymaker to change the economic model. I.e., I introduced, the enterprise valuation is based upon the profit maximization based on the conventional or the traditional economic model, right? If you just add the discount or the premium point to the equation, if you emit greenhouse gas, beyond, your cap level in this certain industry, your value of your firm will be discounted by the amount of greenhouse gas emission you emit. And further to that, if we would like, to draw attention to all the players, particularly the major players in the industry sector, to pay attention also to the health. And you come up with the equation, with the number, and you can use that factor, right, as a discount. But for those who are doing good for the society or for the greater good, you give them the premium. And this is the way we can change the economic model. And that will be really, really powerful. This is...
Thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, I think if the fossil fuel companies are doing harm to people, then we should use the legal system against them. But the problem is it's backward looking. So it allows the harm to occur in the first place. At best, the legal system can help prevent future incursions. In my world, again, this is all way beyond my pace scale. I'm a simple entrepreneur, so I view them as my competitor. And to be honest, the reason why they are so large and powerful is because people buy their service. I don't think of the oil and gas companies as evil. I think of them as very successful competitors. I do not like them, but I don't think they're evil. And I know and I understand that a lot of customers, all of us, buy their services. If we stop buying their services, we reduce their ability to do these things. So at best, what I'm trying to do is provide alternatives that are competitive in the marketplace that are just simply cheaper and better. I don't try to clobber my customers over the head with, this is greener, this is more sustainable, you should buy this. I just go out and say, this is a better service. It's cheaper and more convenient. Would you like to buy it? And I'm hoping that that is a better, more effective way to compete with them.
I just want to add one more point, that as social scientists and public health experts, I think it's our responsibility to highlight that one of the reasons why oil and gas or fossil fuel industries are able to sell their services at cheap cost is because they externalize a lot of that cost. And if you start building that cost in with the cost to your environment, to the air quality, to water, to people's health, to the cost of cancers to families who have been working in either a petroleum facility or black lung disease to coal miners, if you start factoring that cost, you will realize that these are not cheap sources of energy. They are extremely expensive, and then you can see the alternatives that are available that are truly inexpensive before you. But I mean, it's not a level playing field. I mean, at this point, when you're talking about cost, there are a lot of hidden costs that are never exposed and considered while in economic decision making. The second thing about accountability is that, yes, there have been injustices that fossil fuel companies have and continue to perpetuate, and the opportunity in deciding a just transition is to hold them accountable for that injustices. It's not over yet. What we are seeing, and a few weeks ago we had this news of Shell transitioning away from Nigeria, which was celebrated. Like, Shell has sold all its shares in oil companies to local companies and have vanished. They are making a smart business decision because they know that communities are going to hold them accountable for cleanup, remediation of site, restoration of site, and for people's health. So they're making a smart decision right now. They have profited from Nigeria, and now the argument will be it's the government. The industries are able to thrive in certain circumstances where there are weak laws, there is weak social protection. These industries thrive in those. So the lesson that we have to learn is not only hold these industries and these corporations accountable, but also at the same time strengthen the labor laws, strengthen the environmental laws, so that these mistakes can't be repeated in whatever economy that we are planning for the future.
So we need strong policy and regulation to go hand in hand with effectively operationalizing disclosure at the organizational level, whether it be in banks or businesses as well. Can I just check on time? Are we still finishing at midday? We are? Okay, so I think this is a good point now to open the discussion up to the audience. Could you please, if you have a question, come up to one of the microphones and you can ask our speakers. Yes, please. And we might take, just if you line up at the microphones, we might take a couple of questions and then give our speakers a chance to respond. Can I just check, Omnia and Marina, I know it's really early for you. We really appreciate you hanging in there. Do you want to stay on for the question and answer? Or you don't have to, is what I'm saying.
I think I'm okay on this end.
Okay.
I'll wake already, so might as well stay.
Okay,
But
thank you.
thank you for the consideration.
Thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
please, let's have the first question here.
Okay, thank you very much for your good presentations. My name is Stefan Bösner. I'm from the Stockholm Environment Institute. We're a global think tank on environmental issues. And I have a question, maybe bring it back to geopolitics again. And I really loved your intervention of this need to change our systematic thinking. Having a Tesla doesn't solve the problems of individual transport, for instance. I really like that. And also what we as, and there's one of the slides which said like, renewable energies, they avoid all the drawbacks of fossil fuels. Yes and no, because minerals, for instance, solar panels, critical minerals, solar panels are not made of plastic and or cotton candy. It's like very a debate on how these kind of minerals are mined in local communities, for instance. So I would like to ask the panel, how do you foresee this kind of geopolitics changing, a geopolitics of renewables, when we talk about renewable energy deployment, which depend so much on critical mining, for instance, which is concentrated in a few places, for instance, where some global companies control the market, actually. So I wonder whether you can reflect on how to maybe avoid this kind of trap of, renewables, they are decentralized, yes, but the building and the constructing of those is still very, there are pitfalls. So maybe you can reflect on these kind of issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We might take one more question. Marina and Omnia, can you hear the questions? Is it clear to you?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, please, another question.
Thank you very much. My name is Omar from Kenya, Options Consultancy Services. My colleague from Sweden, I think, stole my question partly. I was wondering, this, drive is not, will come at a cost, as you say. We are competing, or, I will not say fighting, but we are trying to have dialogue with the shells. But we may end up creating new shells in DRC, isn't it? With because renewable source of energy needs ingredients, that some of them come from, certain regions that have to be mined with, human cost, environmental degradation cost. But also another example is, like currently we have in Africa some struggle, or let's give you an example between Ethiopia and its neighbors, Sudan, Egypt. Ethiopia wants to build a very huge dam for renewable energy from the Nile, while downstream countries want to increase their forest cover. So really, how do we bring in geopolitics so that we don't really show that the journey we are taking is all good and all rosy without any possible source of conflict or even more damage? Thank you.
Thanks. Given that those two questions are quite similar, I might just take another question from this microphone, please.
Hi, good morning. I'm Ramon San Pascual with the Healthcare Without Harm in Southeast Asia, based in Manila. I'm trying to understand and simplify the arguments that in many ways the climate crisis has facilitated so much inequities in the world, both in the rich countries and in the countries of the South. It gave rise to the multinationals and corporations controlling many of the way we develop our own lifestyle and choices. It developed the energy system that is extractive, but at the end of it, amidst spots of rise of the economy and the middle class, you will see that huge inequity still exists, whether in the south or in the north. So therefore, it is tied up, inequity is tied up in the way the climate crisis has accelerated. Now we're trying to rethink the world. And therefore, recovering or even looking back and trying to step back, if we want to rebuild and rebuild a more equitable earth and humanity, societies and countries, that transition of energy that runs everything should be addressing the inequity. It
Sorry,
cannot be detached.
Can we just move to the question, please?
No, no, I'm just asking now how we think about this whole issue of energy, inequity, and climate, and how do we build the future. I just want comments from our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question from the person behind. Thank you.
Hello, so my name is Per Manbuliam and I'm a medical student from Sirat Hospital, Thailand. And I'm also doing a master degrees in management. So I would like to ask a question for Mr. Pipit. Since you're in like the banking industry, I want to know how does climate change affect like the bank, your bank, and like what are your solutions that you propose? Can you further explain your 3 circles I find on the slides? I find it really interesting. I want to know what are the solutions you can do like right now in this year and for future years, what kinds of solutions that PMAC are in like progress? Thank you.
Thanks. So we've got a few questions there. One is on the supply chain of renewable energy, and also I would imagine its afterlife. And how is that being reshaping geopolitics? Hydroelectric power was another example of transboundary electricity generation that can produce conflict upstream and downstream. And we have another question around the intersection of energy production, equity, and climate change, and then a very specific question for you, Mr. Pipit, on your slides. Who would like to begin?
Okay, I'll throw me under the bus first. So, where shall I start? I think the climate crisis, when we talk about the climate crisis, it is not a single phenomenon. It's actually made up, or it's the result. It's not the cause, it's the result of all of our actions. So I try to avoid absolutes. The do no harm, for example. I understand the concept, I agree with it in general, but let's just do something, or many different things, to try to improve the situation. And I don't think there will be a silver bullet. I don't think there's one way to solve this climate crisis. It is a complex problem that is originated because of our extractive practices and our exploitative practices. We're not going to be able to solve it in one fell swoop. So I think we're going to have to take a whole bunch of different actions. Some of them are not going to be perfect. Batteries currently still use a lot of cobalt. I mean, that's driving human exploitation in DRC. But should we not do that instead? No, I think we should move forward with it. I think we should just try to figure out better ways as quickly as possible to minimize those or remove those problems. But you need to do it one by one, I think. And if we just hold off until we have a perfect solution, I think the problem's going to hit us on the head first.
I somewhat agree and disagree with what Jeff said, and this is our, since last night dinner debate, we've been debating the principle of first do no harm. I think So even also to address your question, I mean, I don't have a definite answer, but I have a set of principles, and that reflect back to the mistakes that we made or we are currently making. If a future that we are envisioning perpetuates the same injustices that have been perpetuated till now, then it's not a solution to me. It's not, because the same people who were asked to give up their land and their homes for the greater good will be asked to make those sacrifices again at the cost of their community, their identity, and the lives of their children. That's not just. And that's not a solution, unfortunately. I mean, again, I come from a very strong environmental justice background, and it's not acceptable. And we can collectively, the brains that can get us to Moon and Mars, I mean, can we not think better or design better? I think it's impossible. It's just that we want to continue to perpetuate those inequities. We want to continue to be driven by profit, and that's where I think Mr. Pippitt in his plenary intervention made a very interesting observation, that if we are driven by wealth, we will continue to perpetuate or maintain the status quo. If we are driven, if our narrative is health, then if there are sources that are problematic, that provide some sort of solution, then what is our principle that we are applying? How are communities participating? Is extractivism the way forward? What's the role of the communities? And to what end? In India, I've seen this, like cities are transitioning to metros and to EVs, but those EVs are externalizing the air pollution cost to the thermal power plants and coal plants in the hinterland. Is that the transition that we're looking at? So, I mean, it comes down to the value of each individual that we hold in our society, and our metrics of assessment need to change, and need to change urgently. I'm sorry if I'm not able to answer your question, but I just feel that they have to be, and the principle of first do no harm gives us the guidance. We need solutions, we need urgent resolution of problems, but it cannot come at the cost of somebody who doesn't have a voice in this room or at the policy table. It cannot.
Okay, we'll go to Mr. Pippitt and then Marina and Omnia. Thanks.
I think, I just would like to give you a very good and recent example that we, people of our generation, have witnessed together, starting from the trade war. You remember, right? The trade war between the US and China. And then come the tech war, the technology war, right? The chip industry, right? And now, my only concern, as we are discussing now, it is going to be the next war, i.e. the climate war, in addition to the physical wars in Ukraine and Russia. So the globalization, we cannot avoid it, right? After the WTO, right? Our economic activity, represented by the wealth maximization model, have been growing so fast, right? And we are deeply interconnected, right? And we have learned that we made a lot of mistakes. Are we going to allow, these negative consequences, to further develop, or are we going to stop it? The question is how we are going to prevent the new development or economic development model, i.e. growing wealth at the cost of the health. This is the question that we are talking about. So my quick solution, based upon, the discussion in this room, what I see is that, I mentioned earlier that what I'm very much concerned about is the trading non-tariff barrier imposed by the major power, right, on the cross-border carbon adjustment or carbon tax. And that is the first one. And the second one, you can think about the powers of technologies and innovation always happen in the West or the North, global North, right? Would it be possible that if any country come up with the so magical carbon capture technology or the new energy, right? That is going to be super clean energy, renewable energy that we are talking about. And within 1 year, it will become public goods available and accessible to every citizen in the world. And that might be a solution that we need to deal, geopolitically, so cross-country, cross-nation, and that would be the solution. So this is only my dream, based upon our discussion in this room. So thank you. So would you like me to continue with the specific question or later on?
I'm just conscious of time. Maybe you could pick it up if you want to come and speak after we've closed. I wanted to give Omnia and Marina a chance for some closing remarks and a response to those questions.
Yeah, I can start and give Marina the closing. But one thing I wanted to add to the question around inequities, it is very important in my perspective to recognize that these solutions it is not an option whether we can mitigate or we should or we don't. And when it comes to, thinking about whether we can deploy renewables or not, again, it is a question that even within the climate discussions and the negotiations, yes, we put on paper that we want to do that by 2030, by 2050, but again, without any means of implementation or financial mechanisms, this is not possible. And we cannot expect that countries that are struggling with their economies, like one of the people who asked the question mentioned several countries, including my own, to be able to do that transition without getting the support and the multilateral funding that can help developing countries do that transition. And whether we can or not, it is demonstrated that with the high level of subsidization, we can redirect this subsidization to fossil fuel towards renewable energy, and we can present many win-win arguments. But for us to do these arguments using the health argument can actually accelerate the urgency of the need to do that. We've seen that in the first time in 28 years, the climate process at COP recognized health and had its own independent day, which in itself shows that health is consistently overlooked, that it took that long for a climate process to recognize it. And the same would go with health integration across energy sectors and other areas and health determining sectors. So this is why I feel that the health equity, with the research, with the science that we have, and with institutions like the Lancet Countdown able to package the science into accessible formats for the business sector, for policymakers, for governments, to use that health impacts and co-benefit science to accelerate the transition that we need, can help us address this nexus between health, energy, and geopolitics.
Thank you. Marina, over to you for the final remarks before we wind up.
Thank you so much. And there's a lot that has been said already, so I think it has been very comprehensively addressed already by my fellow panelists. I think the important thing to take into account is that there's no silver bullet solution. Renewable energies are not a magic solution to climate change. Climate change comes from a fundamental problem of our consumerist, extractivist ways of behavior. So until we don't fix that fundamental problem, it will be very hard to tackle the environmental crisis that we're facing, not only for the climate, but also biodiversity. As was mentioned, extractivist industries could also translate those behaviors to the renewable energy sector. We're seeing some of that already happening with lithium, with minerals that are essential for the renewable energy sector. So there's a deeper, and we could get very philosophical in this room, and I think we would need like another 3 days of session to actually go into the surface of it. But the way that that our behavior, that our ambitions have grown, are the core of the climate crisis and of the ecological crisis that we face altogether. Part of this is quite oversimplistic. We should be more efficient in the use of energy. We should promote energy efficiency first. We should promote more fair distribution of energy consumption. There's a factor of over 10 in the terms of energy consumption between high and low middle income countries. Yeah. So there's a lot of inequity in our consumption that translates across the scope that needs to be fixed first. Are we going to solve that in the short term? Well, probably not. That's a more fundamental problem of humanity. So the question is, what can we do in the shorter term that can allow us to avoid a catastrophic increase in temperatures, a catastrophic climate change? Renewable energies come as part of that solution, gives us a way in a overly capitalistic economy worldwide to have a new energy market, to have a new economic growth, economic development, and to function within current systems. The fundamental question is, how do those systems need to be changed to avoid the growing inequities that we're seeing worldwide, to avoid the environmental destruction that we will see, because the carbon-centric approach is only a tiny, tiny sliver of the big problem that we're facing. A very urgent and acute one, but a tiny sliver of it. So there's a lot more that we need to be doing in terms of changing our way of consumption and protecting people before profit. That is what we currently are not doing that well. So as I said, it's a deep question, it's very fundamental, but we always think that if we build on solidarity, we build on empathy, of understanding of human health and well-being at the center, and that means human health and well-being of everyone in the world, then we can start to find those solutions and those points of agreement where we can deliver a transition. So I leave it there with perhaps less solutions and answers than questions, but thank you very much for those very important points.
Thank you very much, Marina and Omnia, for your remarks and for joining us today at such an ungodly hour. I think this has been a wonderful panel because we have really started to think about the relationship between health and wealth, the foundational nature of change that needs to occur, but also the practical opportunities that we need to implement to be able to make this a just and healthy energy transition. I think we've had a really robust discussion around transformation versus reform. And also we've made the point that health is absolutely foundational and the energy system is foundational to health and well-being. So I think we're really starting to join these up. And unfortunately, we have run out of time, and I see there are more questions. But I would like you to join me in thanking our excellent speakers from abroad and in the room for their contribution today. Sorry, I thought we said... Sorry, I thought you said we had...
We have.
Oh, we're going to 12:30. Yeah. Okay, I'm very sorry about that. That was an unfortunate wind up then. So we have more questions. Shall we? Sorry, Omnia and Marina, it seems that we actually have another 15 minutes. So we're going to keep going. If you need to go, please do. I understand it's very early over there, but we're going to take another round of questions. Okay, please.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the extra time. I'm Joydeep Gupta. I work for the Internews Earth Journalism Network. And I come to this from an environment and energy point of view, to seeing that its health is how extremely important when we do stories on the importance of the just transition. And we have some serious data gaps, which Lancet does fill in some ways, but not enough. I'll be very specific. Shweta talked about health externalities of extracting and using fossil fuels. We would like to see peer-reviewed micro-studies as to exactly what these health externalities are and whether they can be quantified. And I think that is the way to go to push policymakers towards a just transition. If anybody in the panel could point to some sources of material for this, some literature on this, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Okay, I think Omnia and Marina can definitely help there. Let's have another question before we come for an answer.
Thank you so much. Sam Sellers. I'm a contractor with USAID's Global Health Bureau. And thank you to the panelists for an excellent session. But with respect, I think many of you have sort of missed the point. You were asked a question specifically about politics, and you gave answers around policy, and those are two separate things. And how do we make the politics of the moment meet what the policy needs are? You all talked about what we should be doing, and I think there's consensus in the room about what those solutions are. But how do we get there? And Marina, maybe your response, which I guess was supposed to be your closing comments, is very telling, that you have more questions than answers right now. But I think it's really important to call this out. The fact that there's asymmetries when it comes to the politics, that all lives don't have equal political value, and that the people who are disproportionately affected by the health harms of climate change are the populations that have the least political power, and simultaneously the populations that would be most affected by internalizing the externalities associated with fossil fuel use are the populations that have the most political power. And so how do you make the politics of the moment speak to the policy needs? And particularly when it comes to the fossil fuel industry. We heard this morning about the analogy of the tobacco industry. But the tobacco industry is very different in terms of it has a concentrated user base. It provides a product that arguably doesn't benefit people. Many of us flew here. We like fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have a lot of great medical applications. It is a different kind of approach that would be required politically to address the challenges associated with fossil fuel production. So how do you make the politics work to fit the moment? Thank you.
Thanks. Let's take two more questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Natalia Linas. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Center for Health and Human Rights. And I'm delighted by this presentation in geopolitics. And I sort of want to follow up on the question around local politics. I think what we talk about, at that very global level is really important, but we know that a lot of the decisions are happening at the local level, whether it's cities, around the transportations, but increasingly around zoning, around where will transmission lines go, and we know that health inequities also play out both at the global level and within countries. So I do want us to, just bring to the table this idea that politics at the local level may actually be one of the barriers that we often overlook. And in my town of Brookline, I serve on our town council, and it's a powerful town council, but we've seen people who push back against, for example, transmission lines or the sort of, offshore wind because it's not nice. And so these local battles may actually end up being the Achilles heel that because we've been focusing at the global level. So I kind of want to ask you from your context in your countries, how does local link to national to international? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Benita and I am from the DRC. I'm so happy that you raised the issue of the hidden cost of the just transition, because most of the costs associated with it, there is like a human cost to this transition. And you also mentioned about, cobalt in the DRC and how so many people are dying. And this is not new. Historically, I was thinking that whenever there's a transition, if we go back to industrialization, people needed rubber, and it mostly came from the DRC, for example, and millions of people died. In the 1900s, people needed some other kind of natural resources like uranium found in the DRC, and people died. Now there is cobalt. Okay, it's a transition and all those things. There is a hidden cost and people are dying. Now we're talking about, maybe we need lithium because cobalt is so bad. People in the DRC are dying. We can go back to lithium now. We will also find lithium in the DRC, lithium in Zimbabwe. So it seems like it's the same thing happening over and over and over again, right? But for the future, what can we do now to not repeat this wheel? How can we start accounting for those lives that we are already losing right now? And how can we just stop this? Because of course there is money, of course there's all those things, but human life is the most important here. How can we account for that?
Okay, a range of questions there. Data gaps and health externalities. How do we make the politics speak to the policy needs? How do we make this transition locally and regionally appropriate? And how can local politics, can they potentially be a barrier that we need to overcome? And finally, the last question on how do we stop repeating the mistakes of history, particularly with regard to resource extraction. Who would like to have a go?
I can go a little bit. Oh, Omnia, go ahead.
Omnia, go first, and then we'll go to Shweta.
No, I just wanted to take the question around locally led solutions. And I wanted to, one thing in my perspective is very important is how we, having that platform where local leaders, mayors, and councils are actually doing their own solutions successfully. So having that knowledge sharing, because it is very important to recognize their role in implementing these policies and also identifying the gaps. Why aren't they leading the solutions that why are there challenges? What are they facing? And there are a diversity of challenges. I was recently part of this event at COP, where we had mayors coming from the Middle East region sharing the incredible work that they were doing around transitioning, as well as building the adaptive capacity of their cities. And many of them were sharing that it was a challenge for them to get that technical assistance, the capacity building of understanding what solutions work for them, because also adapting solutions to local contexts coming from the global level. But they were successfully able to do that because they were supported with the necessary funding, grants to be able to implement that, trainings, but also learning from each other. And they were coming from the MENA region as well as the Caribbean and Latin America. So it's such a great way of bridging different initiatives and knowledge sharing, experiencing, which is important for us to equally leverage the impacts, but also the solutions that are often not identified, elevated, or scaled up as sufficiently as they can be, especially at the local level.
Yeah, I was busy jotting down some, again, principles, and also maybe it will sound a little bit jargonistic, but that's not the intention. I was thinking about, and I mean, these are questions that are not necessarily new, and these are the challenges that collectively we have not been able to tackle. Now, the issue about data, Joydeep, frankly speaking, we say externalization of cost. We have not seen any of those studies anywhere. Wherever we have seen studies, they are hyper local, and they kind of get lost in the system because it doesn't matter. It's not impactful enough. It's just about 5 villages or 10 villages or a district. It's that hyper local. So definitely there is a gap that needs to be further strengthened when the arguments that we're making about externalization of cost, which we know from our lived experience, but needs more accessible data, and data that can be acted upon, because it's just data for the sake of data is also not a very good thing. What has worked in the some of the environmental justice struggles, or even like examples of public health movements like tobacco or cholera or HIV/AIDS, is public participation, access to information and demystified information, knowledge that is accessible. It's not in hands of a few, but it's hands of many. There is a solidarity, there is a cross-sectional need for a cross-sectional solidarity, because these are problems that are complex, that affect all of us. It's unfortunate that the solutions are not thought together with each sector involved. So there is a need for a cross-sectional solidarity that is essential, and especially communities that are most marginalized need to make that connection with other communities, because the stories are the same. It's the names of those communities change, but the experience are the same, and that power needs to be visibilized. Legal intervention and massive public mobilization. I think without that outrage and public mobilization, politics will not shift, powers will not shift, and unless people come together, we will continue to deliberate and think about these problems and not solutions. So these are some of the cross-cutting principles that we've seen have worked in, and in all of this, again, I'm just like talking about the health angle and the health professionals. If you see in all of these historical struggles or movements that have shaped our society, you talk about nuclear war, you talk about racial justice, you talk about women's rights to vote, you will see that health community has played an important role. It's generating that evidence and actively sharing that evidence that has flipped the narrative. And I think in all of this, the role of health professionals and the health community is super critical, super ignored, and super necessary to put in the forefront.
Okay, so we need a local grassroots transformational politics, but to the question about the relationship between politics and policy, there's a lot of evidence to show why we need to shift and all of the benefits. The question is, how does that local grassroots transformational politics connect at the national and the international scale to transform geopolitics? And that's what we need to then get good policy outcomes. So does anyone want to directly tackle that question around the politics that we need to see to get the policy outcomes that we need?
I can, more than an answer, perhaps reflect on the difficulties. The whole international negotiations on climate change are based around politics and geopolitics. It's been it's been 28 cycles, we're towards the 29th. And here we are. If we had that answer, we wouldn't be here. Exactly. It's the key of the question. How do you transform politics, and particularly international geopolitics? That it has dominated the landscape, not only through climate change, but also through all the other struggles. We're going to have a pivotal year. There's going to be very important elections this year. There's elections with very, very powerful countries and entities globally in which we're seeing climate denialism coming to power. Yeah. We're going to be facing a very difficult time ahead with economic recession, with two wars, one which is apparently expanding and is at very risk of expanding substantially. We're seeing the whole geopolitics changing quite dramatically. And climate change comes to add salt to that wound. Yeah. So how do you transform, how do you make politics transform into the policies that we need? I think that is the key of the question. If we had the answer, if anyone has the answer in the public, I would urge you to come and let us know. But one thing that is very clear is that the international negotiations, the UN negotiations, the UN has been put into a lot of pressure recently because of the ongoing wars and our incapacity to act effectively. It's still the only mechanism that brings countries together. And international negotiations are one of the few landscapes in which low-income countries have quite a bit of weight and can have a very loud and very important voice. So it's important that we protect and we reinforce and we elevate those fora. But there's a lot, in my humble opinion, and there's people that know a lot more about how these negotiations go than me, but there's a lot that we need to be doing in terms of ensuring that those negotiations are not excuses for inaction. Mm-hmm. So they haven't delivered the pace of ambition that they've been promising. There's enormous faults in the international negotiations. The consensus agreements that need to be reached have often meant that the outcome is not the outcome that works for most countries or most of the world. So there's a lot that needs to be fixed about our international negotiations. And geopolitics always defines how that goes. But I think it's very important to note that, and going back to the grassroots movement question, that the bottom-up pressure is fundamental to get those negotiations and to get international geopolitics to work. And that ultimately it's people on the ground that are affected by these politics and these policies. So it's fundamental that we do pay attention to local communities, to local politics, to mayors of cities who are at the forefront of climate action, who are able to bring different departments together a lot more effectively that national level policymakers are able to do. And that we do support those grassroots movements and that pressure bottom up, particularly from the health sector and from health voices.
Okay, thank you. One final question. Can the very powerful finance sector reshape geopolitics?
As the, when I look at it right, a global financial and capital market might be able to, but it's not as a nation. Thailand, for example, we are a very small nation. We are part of global capital market. As I mentioned, right, very specifically on the cross-border carbon tax. Nothing else, but we have to comply. If the Chinese would like to implement, the cross-border carbon tax, we have to conform. EU, we have to conform. So we have to be friendly with everyone. Right, this is not about the politics. It's not about the politics, it's about the economics. Right, it is, this is my blunt, conclusion, in terms of, how the banking in Thailand, can shape the geopolitics landscape, to make sure that our world is going to be in a more sustainable fashion. Impossible.
But I think we can all agree that it's about different actors at different scales exerting pressure and working together and forming alliances to move us in the right direction towards net zero. I've already done my concluding remarks, so I won't do it again. Thank you so much to our speakers. Please join me in thanking them, and thank you to the audience for your participation.